From aircraft to leaders. Battles.
Stalingrad factories were fought inch by inch.
To inventions.
Producing the wonder drug penicillin.
Warfare has shaped our lives.
Girls are able to release men for the fighting regiments.
Driven by a century of technological innovation.
Home in on their targets by radar.
3, 2, 1.
And pushing soldiers to the edge.
Lumina here. Watch it, fellows.
The race for the tactical advantage is often the decisive contest in the war.
The world's most destructive force has been unleashed.
There's always a technological race in warfare.
Sophisticated new technology. Development of the first computers.
Technology has massively changed the face of warfare in the 20th century.
This series identifies and ranks the most iconic and most influential features of war. With game-changing innovations that captured the popular imagination and tipped the balance in the critical hour. These are the top 10s of warfare. In this program, we look at the battles that changed warfare, ranking each in terms of its scale, tactical innovation, iconic status, and overall war-winning impact.
Battles have changed the course of history.
It is not going to go away. War is part of our human makeup.
Battles make history, they change history, and that is why we remain so fascinated by them.
At number 10 is a battle that defined the Gulf War. The 2nd of August, 1990. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded their tiny neighboring country, Kuwait. Armored vehicles rolled into the capital city. Helicopters moved troops in to secure the city center. 4 months later, after a UN deadline for the peaceful withdrawal of troops had passed, in the Iraq capital, Baghdad, defiant crowds prepared for war.
Any aggression against Iraq, we will all fight.
Are you prepared to die for that?
Yes, sure.
In an attempt to deal a knockout blow to the Iraqi ground forces, a United States-led coalition launched a stunning aerial bombardment. It was the start of Operation Desert Storm.
The strategy for Desert Storm was initially to use air power to completely degrade Iraq's ability to defend itself.
Heavily armed stealth fighters targeted Iraqi military installations. Each mission encountered intense anti-aircraft fire. Iraqi missile launch pads were targeted and hit with deadly accuracy. After 12 days of total bombardment, Iraqi armored divisions made a move on the ground to take the battle to the coalition at the town of Al-Kafji.
Saddam Hussein felt that a ground operation was feasible in its own right, and to some extent he was proved correct in that the Iraqis were able to take Kafji.
Coalition forces moved into the deserts of Saudi Arabia to retake the town. It was the first time many soldiers would put their training into action.
I think the thing that took a lot of us by surprise was just the sheer size of it. I mean, this desert was bigger than anything we had ever seen. I mean, you couldn't fly across this desert on 2 loads of gas. It was huge and desolate and barren.
What happened next was the decisive ground battle of the Gulf War, and makes our list at number 10, the Battle of Al-Kafji. Conflict, the Gulf War, 1991. Location, Saudi Arabia. Dates, 29th of January to the 1st of February, combatants, the Iraqi army against a coalition of Saudi, Qatari, and US forces.
You know there are enemy tanks that have moved into Khafji.
Check.
Iraqis have come down for the first time.
Yes.
And invaded a city in Saudi Arabia. What do you men want to do with them?
Destroy them. Before they destroy us.
Hey, look here, we got two unidentified vehicles up there in the front, so keep an eye on what's...
The Allied plan was to halt the Iraqi advance and retake the town.
The attack on Khafji involved Iraqi armor and motorized infantry. It's a significant moment because it demonstrated that it wasn't all going to go the coalition's way and that they needed to take into account the somewhat more basic but still potent capability of the Iraqi forces.
At first, the coalition forces were held off.
Incoming.
Then, they launched an attack. This unit of Marines were armed with a 50 caliber machine gun, while helicopter gunships provided covering fire. Marines mounted a ground offensive.
Batteries of US Marine howitzers have been pounding Iraqi positions inside Kuwait, forcing the enemy back onto the defensive. Tonight, Allied artillery is pinning down Iraqi troops still holed up in Al-Khafji.
While tanks advanced on the ground, over 200 airstrikes pounded the enemy for 4 days, before the Iraqi offensive was finally shut down.
Okay, we got a destroyer up front.
The Marines moved in. The enemy had fled or been captured.
Congratulations. A very significant victory.
The battle had exacted a heavy toll. 25 US personnel and 18 Saudi soldiers were lost. On the Iraqi side, an estimated 2,000 fatalities. It was the single bloodiest battle for American forces since Vietnam.
It had long ago been agreed that the honor of liberating the capital would fall to them. And to greet them, the people of Kuwait, who'd been freed from 7 months of virtual house arrest.
After the battle at Al-Khafji, Iraqi forces were on the back foot. Within a month, the capital city was freed, and Kuwaiti troops led the liberation. Iraq had accepted the terms of a ceasefire, and the war with Saddam was over. The Battle of Al-Khafji was decisive in determining the outcome of the first Gulf War in 1991, and makes it into our top 10. Next up on our list is a battle that changed world history. In 1948, after the Second World War, China faced economic chaos. Outside of the cities, mass unemployment left a population in poverty. A civil war had split the vast country for decades. On one side, the nationalist armies, led by the president Chiang Kai-shek, based in the capital city. On the other side, the communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, who had growing support in the countryside. When peace talks between the two sides failed, the battle lines were drawn.
Chiang Kai-shek was in a very good position militarily, stronger armed forces, and he even had military knowledge as being a general. Mao was a political and military leader, The strategy was to be strong in the countryside, to win the support of the people there, to build up military forces, and only then move to urban centers, encircle these towns, and take them when the time was right.
The stronghold on the front line was the city of Suzhou, and it's the battle there that comes into our list at number 9. Conflict, the Chinese Civil War. Combatants, National Revolution Army versus Communist People's Liberation Army. Nationalist losses, 250,000 killed or wounded. The People's Liberation Army losses, estimated 100,000.
The numbers involved were enormous.
You have hundreds of thousands of communist forces taking on their opponents, the nationalists, who also have, of course, hundreds of thousands of forces.
The nationalist strategy was to defend the area by protecting outlying positions with 7 army divisions. But that meant they were spread out. And that played into Mao's hands.
Mao's strategy, as always, is to concentrate massive force on the weakest point of the enemy. You take out the weakest guy.
The strategy was to use the advantage of numbers and through a series of battles destroy pieces of the nationalist army bit by bit, various divisions bit by bit, to encircle them and then destroy them.
In a series of battles around Suzhou lasting 39 days, nationalist forces were hit hard. Eventually, 100,000 troops were lost or injured.
Very, very highly trained and well-equipped nationalist forces were basically annihilated. And this sent the message to the rest of China that the war was going only one way, and that way was Mao's way.
After Suzhou was taken, across China, a popular uprising followed. Within months, the communists had captured Beijing, and Mao declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. The war was over. The Battle of Suzhou is in our top 10 at number 9. Next up is a small-scale firefight, which would have consequences on a global scale. 1993, Mogadishu, Somalia, on the east coast of Africa. The country had been caught in a deadly conflict for 2 years. A United Nations force entered the country to restore order, backed up by American troops.
Our objective here is to come in and display maximum force to let everybody know that we mean business. We are here to help these people, not to hurt them.
People need help, that's what we're here for.
And what it's going to mean to us is we've got a secure environment. I mean, before here in the port, you had fighting, people being shot all the time, you couldn't unload the food, you had it being extorted, you had trucks coming in and driving off with food.
Over the next few weeks, tensions mounted. To prevent all-out conflict, the US aimed to capture the most powerful militia leader, the rogue warlord, General Aidid. Their manhunt would turn into the Battle of Mogadishu. Conflict, the Somalia Civil War. Combatants, American Special Forces against tribal militia. Strength, 4,000 to 6,000 militiamen against 160 special forces. Key militia weaponry, rocket-propelled grenade launchers.
Helicopter gunships provided cover while UN ground troops closed in on General Aidid and his militiamen, urging them to surrender.
Please evacuate the area now.
His stockpile of weapons seized. By now, the United Nations had ordered General Aidid's arrest, but he was already on the run.
I think I'm stronger than any time in the past. I'm a free man. I'm staying in my land. I'm Somali. I'm with my people. Therefore, I'm in a very good position.
With the wanted man on the run, 3 months later, Aidid's command center was once again the target of an American assault. This time, to capture the commander's lieutenants. American gunships flew over the city, attacking the compound.
The actual operation which started the Battle of Mogadishu, it involved moving a small detachment of Delta Force operators into the center of Mogadishu, protected by a company of US Army Rangers who would seize these Aidid men.
But the operation didn't go to plan.
The situation then became increasingly confused. What should have been a quick surgical operation turned into an enormous sort of shambles. Groups of American soldiers within Mogadishu were isolated and besieged, in effect, by Somali militias.
There was a 15-hour firefight. The militia's weapon of choice, a rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG.
RPGs, in the hands of somebody who's very skilled in their use, can be incredibly destructive. Although the sighting on them is extremely crude, a helicopter is a fairly large target to hit. And one struck by an RPG has no chance whatsoever.
2 Black Hawk helicopters were targeted and hit. Over 500 Somali militiamen had been killed in the battle, but the rebels celebrated victory. Their key trophy, 2 Black Hawk helicopters shot down by RPGs.
You have millions of dollars worth of helicopter crashing to the ground in flames, fired by somebody who had probably never even shot at a helicopter before, and using a rocket warhead that costs about $30.
With only 1 survivor from the downed helicopters and 18 US soldiers killed in total, what started as a humanitarian mission ended in the humiliating withdrawal of US troops from the region.
It had a profound impact because it made Americans, and it made the American military, question their ability to get involved in interventions of this kind.
The Battle of Mogadishu wasn't the biggest or bloodiest battle in our top 10, but its shocking effects rank it in our list at number 8. Next up is the greatest tank battle ever.
Many battles have turned on the tiniest chances of fate. What if this had happened? What if that had happened? And those kind of questions fascinate historians and keep us talking about battles and war so much.
1943, Russia. Hitler's Wehrmacht was face-to-face with Stalin's Red Army. By the summer of 1943, the Germans were on the back foot. But they'd been re-equipped with new weaponry, including the formidable Tiger tank. Both rival armies centered around the Russian town of Kursk. Hitler's plan? To regain the initiative.
The problem, though, is the Russians are waiting and they know what's coming at them. This is an attack that there's no sense of surprise in.
The Russians, right up to the eve of battle, are building monstrous defences all around that Kursk salient. So there are up to 7 lines, defensive lines, defending it, each of which are riddled with mines, wire, gun emplacements, and vast amounts of firepower.
At number 7 in our top 10 is the Battle of Kursk. Conflict, Second World War. German strength, 900,000 soldiers, 2,700 tanks, 10,000 artillery guns. Soviet Union strength, 1.3 million soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 30,000 artillery pieces.
It's the largest firepower battle because there was some 30,000 artillery pieces. You've got an artillery piece every 10 meters. That is a level which is entirely unprecedented.
In spite of heavy fire, German tanks advanced.
There were over 2 million men involved, and there were sort of around 6,000 tanks.
Russians, by using mines, by using anti-tank ditches, by using their artillery might, they are actually able to defeat and absorb the massive power of these advancing tanks, and more tanks at Kursk are actually knocked out by minefield and tank traps and the terrain, in essence, than were actually knocked out by the enemy's anti-tank guns.
After 2 weeks of intense battling, Russian counterattacks had forced the Germans back 45 miles. But the victory was costly for the Red Army. 860,000 casualties and over 1,000 tanks lost. While the Germans suffered fewer losses, 200,000 casualties and 500 tanks, it's the last time they would take a step east. Hitler's attack plan had failed.
After the Battle of Kursk in the summer of '43, really the German army is consistently on the retreat.
What is most significant about Kursk is it marks this era of new professionalism in the Red Army. They've really worked out how to defeat the Germans by this point.
The Battle of Kursk was the greatest tank battle of the Second World War and makes our top 10 at number 7. Next on our list is an aerial battle. By the end of June 1940, mainland Europe was in the hands of Germany. France had fallen, and Britain was expected to be next. While Hitler planned a seaborne invasion, the feared and heavily armed Luftwaffe sought to gain control of the skies over the English Channel.
As far as Churchill was concerned, the Germans were poised to invade. If we lost aerial supremacy, the door was basically wide open, so we had to win.
At number 6 in our top 10 is the Battle of Britain. Conflict, Second World War. Dates, 10th of July to the 31st of October 1940. Estimated combat-ready aircraft at the start of battle, German Luftwaffe 2,500, British Fighter Command 640.
Battle royal begins, and the Royal Air Force are still shooting them down at the rate of about 4 to 1.
No one would question that the Battle of Britain was of enormous strategic importance.
This is a battle for national survival. We were determined to fight to the absolute end and die trying if necessary.
The first day of the battle saw just a handful of planes from Fighter Command defending against Germany's mighty Luftwaffe. Dogfights filled the skies for weeks. After a month of aerial combat, the Luftwaffe amassed a fleet of bombers and fighters for a new wave of attacks. Their aim? To take out Britain's airfield defenses. While the German bombers approached, anti-aircraft guns fired from the ground, and pilots once again scrambled into action.
I had never seen so many planes in the sky at one time.
Suddenly we heard on the RT from down below, we've been hit. Looked down, and the airfield had disappeared completely. 120 bombs had just blotted out.
Key to Fighter Command's chances of survival was a new technology: radar.
Fighter Command's strategy for defending the UK was centered around being able to react to incoming attacks.
All around the coast of Britain, 40 radar towers watched over the coastline 24/7. They could report the positions of approaching planes from over 100 miles away.
Britain has the first fully coordinated air defense system the world has ever known, and it's unbelievably efficient and well thought through.
After 67 days of hard-fought defense, the next dawn raid on the 15th of September would prove to be the final showdown. 500 Nazi bombers and fighters attacked, met in battle by 500 Spitfire and Hurricane fighter planes.
on that particular day, we had a great success. And I was firing at one Dornier 17, and I was obviously hitting it because they began to bail out. A little later, I saw another Dornier 17 flying across my middle. I attacked that, and it was streaming and very unhappy. It would splosh into the water. So I was credited with 4 aircraft on that particular flight.
Britain had been stretched to the limit. But after 4 months of scrapping in the skies, the Battle of Britain was won. At the price of almost 1,000 British aircraft and almost 2,000 German planes, it was Hitler's first defeat of the war. An achievement of the fighter crews that Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognized.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
The Battle of Britain comes into our list at number 6. We're down to the final 5 in our top 10 battles of warfare. So far, we've had a desert engagement, a battle that built a nation, and an iconic clash in the skies. Still to come, a game-changing naval conflict, and the greatest battle in history. But next up is a naval battle. In December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. America's Navy was nearly knocked out. In the months after, the US Navy launched its biggest ever seaborne fleet. 16 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, 33 cruisers, 171 destroyers. But the Imperial Japanese fleet was even bigger, with 10 aircraft carriers and 10 battleships, among them the Yamato, the heaviest and most heavily armed ever built. In May 1942, the 2 mighty navies clashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japan came out the victor and continued to dominate the rest of the Pacific.
Japanese conquest had reached a high watermark. They controlled pretty much everything from China all the way down nearly to Australia and far out into the Pacific. And there was no intention of them stopping expanding.
There's a certain amount of hubris coming in here because the Japanese are starting to get victory disease. They're starting to become just a little bit overconfident and just a little bit complacent.
1 month later, the 2 navies clashed again in what became the most crucial battle of the Pacific War. And it all took place at a remote American island. It was called the Battle of Midway. Conflict, Second World War. Location, Midway Island, Pacific Ocean. Combatants, Imperial Japanese Navy versus United States Navy. On the 4th of June, 1942, American bombers fought with the Japanese fleet as it approached Midway Island.
The enemy fleet was closely clustered together when American bombers swept down like a bolt from the blue to their surprise attack. Great damage was done to Japan's fighting ships, many of which were hit and were soon blazing furiously.
The Japanese Naval Command had divided its ships into separate groups, but the tactic backfired.
What that meant was that the Japanese carrier force was left rather exposed.
The next day, the Japanese targeted one of America's biggest ships, the aircraft carrier Yorktown.
There's a dive bomber coming right at them. The Yorktown was hit, but only damaged.
the US attacks continued.
First day we hit about 30 ships of all types, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports. Second day we hit the carriers.
4 Japanese carriers were sunk, ships that carried nearly 300 planes.
The invasion forces were hit and hit and hit again.
At 10 a.m. on the 4th of June, the war is very much going the Japanese way. By 11 a.m. on the 4th of June, that balance has tipped, and it is a balance that is never reversed again. Aircraft carrier power was really, really important. Surface vessels alone, capital ships, battleships, heavy cruisers, that's just not enough.
The loss of those carriers is absolutely catastrophic to Japanese plans.
On the 7th of June, the battle was finally over. Japan suffered huge losses. 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, and an estimated 3,000 men.
The Battle of Midway is unquestionably a key turning point in the war in the East and the war in the Pacific.
For turning the tide of the war, the Battle of Midway makes it into our top 10 at number 5. Next up is a surprise attack. January 1968, Vietnam. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched what became known as the Tet Offensive.
The secret plan of the North Vietnamese was to launch a very broad offensive across the whole of South Vietnam, which they hoped would induce a general uprising amongst the population of South Vietnam.
During the Tet Offensive, about 100 cities were attacked by many fighters, which is of course a major logistical and organizational feat. It also is quite surprising that the Americans didn't know more about it. There was some intelligence, but they didn't really take it seriously enough.
The clever part of the Tet Offensive was that it was done without very much warning.
In Saigon, the US Embassy was attacked. Viet Cong guerrillas trapped American staff inside the building for 6 hours. But it was a street battle in the country's 3rd largest city that would have the biggest impact on the war, and is on our list at number 4. The Battle of Hue. Conflict, Vietnam War. Dates, 30th of January to the 3rd of March, 1968. Combatants, People's Liberation Army and Viet Cong versus South Vietnamese Army and United States Marines.
Hue is one of the largest cities in South Vietnam. It's quite close to the border with North Vietnam, and it was situated in a strategically important site on the Perfume River, which controlled movement in and out of the interior of Vietnam.
By the end of the first day, the Viet Cong flag flew above the walls of the city's ancient citadel. The next day, the US Marines counterattacked. With the city's residents locked in behind closed doors, the battle began, building by building.
The Americans weren't prepared to fight urban warfare, a street battle at this point in time. They were prepared to fight in the jungle, in open plains, but not in hand-to-hand combat.
The problem with fighting in streets, particularly when there's been, there's a lot of damage already done, is that it's very difficult to identify where your targets are. The threat can be everywhere. So it becomes quite frightening.
Initially, the Americans tried to move forwards, but small companies, they even used tanks and to move behind, and they were beaten back. And it was very slow and very painful and heavy casualties in order to take even a couple of 100 meters.
After 9 days, US reinforcements took up positions around the citadel. But the Viet Cong would not give up the city without a fight.
There were heavy casualties, a couple of thousands, on the part of the communists. But the town was finally, after 3 weeks, in the hands of the Americans again.
The Battle of Hue was the longest and bloodiest of the Tet Offensive. Americans lost over 200 killed in action and over 1,000 wounded.
The Battle of Hue is often referred to as something that was the crucial turning point in the Vietnam War. While it seemed to be, in the end, a military victory for the Americans and the South Vietnamese allies, psychologically it was a different matter.
The impact in the long term was that it demonstrated to both the United States administration and probably more importantly to the United States people that this was a war that was going to be a lot more difficult to win than they had previously imagined.
From 1968 onwards, you see the support for the American war in Vietnam eroding slowly and surely.
The war-defining Battle of Hue ranks at number 4 in our list of top 10 battles of warfare. But next on our list is a battle that would go down in history as the bloodiest ever. 1916, France. Over a year into the First World War, and there was deadlock on the Western Front. The Allied commanders in Britain and France sensed that a great victory was needed to boost morale. At number 3 in our top 10 is the Battle of the Somme. Conflict, First World War. Dates, 1st of July to the 18th of November 1916. Peak Allied strength, 51 British divisions and 48 French divisions. German army strength, 50 divisions. On the 1st of July 1916, the British began pounding German positions along a 20-mile line. Over 5 days, they fired almost 2 million shells.
There's been a tremendous, earth-shaking bombardment. If you just hear one gun go off now, it sounds deafening. Imagine thousands of them firing together.
Then, the guns stopped.
The countdown starts. 5 minutes to go, men. 4 minutes to go, men. 3 minutes to go, men. 2 minutes to go. 1 minute. And then they have to climb up the ladders and go over the top. And as they do, the German guns open up, the machine guns, the artillery, and all hell broke loose.
After initially being forced back, the Germans regained some of the ground later that day. By the end of the day, the British had suffered 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead. No territorial advantage had been gained.
It's a dreadful day. Why did it go wrong? It went wrong for so many different reasons. Our army wasn't ready. We didn't have enough guns. We thought we did, but we needed 3-4 times as many. We needed 5-10 times as many shells. We weren't ready, and unfortunately the Germans were. It was a disaster.
But the fighting continued.
The Somme was not one day. The Somme is a 3, 4, 5 month campaign with constant battles. Some of them small, just a couple of battalions or 2 or 3 battalions going over the top. Some of them huge battles that were almost as big as the first day.
After months of battle, the Germans had eventually been pushed back, but the total number of dead was staggering. Over 1 million killed on both sides. Yet, despite the devastating losses, did the Somme offensive achieve anything?
There were so many lessons learned from the Somme, everything from artillery tactics, in every way. The tank was introduced. They didn't quite master how to use it yet, but they were learning. They learned how to bring up reserves. It sounds small, but to take the attack forward.
The Somme is really a great victory for the Allies because the German army after the Somme is never the same.
You can never judge the Battle of the Somme by ground gained. That is an irrelevant measurement. It's not where the line is. It's how many of the German divisions you can chew up, how many Germans you can kill.
The Battle of the Somme makes it into the top 3 of our top 10 battles. Next up, an epic urban struggle that changed the course of history. August 1942, Russia. The German army had invaded over a year before, quickly advancing into the Russian heartland, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake.
Their victories are all about speed of operation, about getting a massive amount of force to just overwhelm your enemy very, very quickly. The moment they can't do that, and this is what Stalin realizes, they are in trouble. They start to become unstuck.
While Moscow remained in their sights, the Germans turned their focus onto Russia's key industrial city, bearing the name of the country's leader, Joseph Stalin.
Stalingrad, simply by virtue of its name, held a certain amount of prestige, and I suspect that Hitler felt that if he was able to take the city which bore the name of his principal opponent, then this would deal a significant propaganda blow to the Russians.
The fight would become known as the Battle of Stalingrad. Conflict, Second World War. Location, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Peak German army strength, 1,040,000 men. Peak Red Army strength, 1,140,000 men.
It's undeniable that Stalingrad was one of the biggest and most destructive battles fought in the 20th century and probably throughout history.
First, Germany attacked the city with an air bombardment that triggered a giant firestorm.
The Germans think that Stalingrad is going to be quite an easy victory.
But the Russians were under orders to hold fast.
As the German army approached, the decision was later taken for political reasons not to evacuate the rest of the population. It was felt that Red Army soldiers would fight harder for Mother Russia if they were defending their own citizens.
What happens is the civilian population stay and fight in Stalingrad, that the forces there do not give an inch. And so what is supposed to be a comparatively easy battle for the Germans then becomes a dogged siege.
The Nazi invaders fought their way into the city, but faced fierce resistance.
It's absolutely unforgiving. You're moving from street to street, from building to building, from room to room, and every step that you take, somebody is opposing you. Somebody is trying to kill you. This was happening day by day, hour by hour.
A sniper waits his chance. This man has killed 40 Germans, and he awaits his 41st. The battles of Stalingrad factories were fought inch by inch. Gains of territory were counted in precious yards.
By late September, the Germans raised the swastika flag in the center of town. But they still couldn't dislodge the Russians from the sprawling industrial quarters of the city. Then, the long, cold winter set in. The Germans ran short of men and ammunition. The Russians took the initiative. They launched a counter-offensive, using reinforcements to encircle the enemy. The Germans found themselves depleted of resources, and those who weren't killed were taken prisoner. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 5 months, 3 weeks, and a day.
In terms of the number of casualties, around about 800,000 on the German side, around about 1.2 million on the Soviet side, not including civilians.
For the Soviets, it's an amazing victory and something to be celebrated, and the Russian people today are rightly proud of the stand that they made, because that battle was one of the turning points of the Second World War.
The Battle of Stalingrad is in our list at number 2. At number 10, the Battle of Kafji. At 9, the Battle of Sucho in the Chinese Civil War. Then the street fight of Mogadishu is at number 8. The tank battle of Kursk comes in at number 7. At 6, the Battle of Britain. In the top 5, the Battle of Midway. At 4, the Battle of Hue in Vietnam. The Battle of the Somme comes in at number 3. At 2, the Battle of Stalingrad. And our number 1 top 10 battle will be revealed next. The 6th of June, 1944. D-Day. The beaches of northern France.
D-Day is probably the best planned and one of the largest operations of this type, if not the largest ever attempted.
It involved thousands and thousands of ships. It involved 10 to 12,000 aircraft. It involved millions of men on the ground. It was the largest amphibious operation in history.
It's a magnificent example of a set-piece operation, one that's been planned more or less from the word go to the last detail.
The aim? Take Normandy back from the grip of the Nazis, and then the rest of Europe. On one side, the Allied forces led by General Eisenhower. On the other side, the Germans, commanded by General Rommel. The Germans knew the battle would come. What they didn't know was when, and precisely where.
Rommel is facing an enormous challenge because he's got to defend against the invasion, and yet he doesn't know quite where it's going to be. Nor does he have enough troops, manpower, or weapons for the job.
It was the fight that would determine the outcome of the Second World War, the Battle of Normandy. Conflict, Second World War, combatants, German army versus Allied invasion force. Dates, 6th of June 1944 to mid-July 1944. Location, Normandy, France. The Armada launched with 7,000 ships and over 11,000 aircraft. The battle began with heavy aerial bombings and intense naval bombardment, while 150,000 troops prepared to face the fight.
The weather was pretty poor. It was cold, it was wet, it had been miserable, but for most of them it's going to be their first time in combat. It's the first time that they've faced up against this mythical beast, the Wehrmacht. You've got that sense of uncertainty, that fear. Looking around you, you see what is the largest invasion force that's ever been assembled. You've got aircraft flying overhead, you've got the gun line, battleships, cruisers, destroyers off the coast of Normandy, ready to give that supporting fire, and you feel you're part of something absolutely enormous.
Facing enemy fire during the landings, over 10,000 men were killed.
The Allies are faced with a heavily defended coastline. The Germans have been building what they call the Atlantic Wall, Fortress Europa, all the way down from the Norwegian coast down to the Spanish border. So there are fixed defences, concrete bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, anti-invasion defences, what were nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, great big lumps of iron in the water. You've got very difficult conditions.
In spite of the German defences, Allied troops took the beaches. Over the next 5 days, a further 100,000 troops were shipped in. fighting on the beaches had been hard, it was only a taster of what the Allies could expect inland. The battle moved into the towns and villages of Normandy.
On D-Day itself, the Allies have all the benefits of the element of surprise, but the crucial moments are D-Day +1, D-Day +2, +3, +4, where the Allies are desperately trying to get that toehold, trying to build up that initial bridgehead they've got in Normandy. That is the time to knock them back into the sea. Once those forces build up too much, it's too late.
The German fighting strength was backed up by 9 panzer divisions. The Allied advance was unstoppable.
They can have a battle, the Germans can hold up the Allied advance, but ultimately they're never going to get them out of France again.
In just 3 weeks, the Allies had landed almost 1 million men, 100,000 vehicles, and over 400,000 tons of supplies. Normandy was taken. It was the decisive defeat for the German army. Within 12 weeks, the Allies had liberated Paris, and Berlin was next. The do-or-die Battle of Normandy earned its place at the top of our top 10. 10 battles that changed warfare, 10 battles that shaped the world.